So, empathy. We've been talking about it the entire show. Hopefully, you've gone and taken the "What type of empath are you" quiz. If not, what's your problem? Second of all, this is one of these topics that comes as a law of attraction coach and in this conversation for 20 years. I've been dealing with this even before I kind of knew what empathy was and what an empath was and all of that. This is something that comes up all the time. So my folks will very often talk to me about how they feel bombarded by other people's energy and have a hard time managing it. So we're going to be talking with Lola here in a minute because she's an expert in dealing with just that. She's got courses on it and all sorts of fun stuff that we're going to talk about. I urge you to go check out her site and dig into her story. It's really fascinating. But for those of you who deal with that, and I've never really thought of myself necessarily as an empath, but I do get drained in certain situations around people and things like that. And so I took the quiz this morning. We'll talk about my result in just a second. But first of all, let me just go ahead and bring her in here. Lola, thank you for being here. It's so nice to meet you.
It's so great to be here. Yes, I'm so happy.
Awesome. So you have such an interesting story, and I was telling you just a moment ago that I went to your YouTube channel this morning to kind of get a sense of, what else you do, how, just see if I could find anything else out about you. And what struck me was this black and white video that was named something like A Mom's Journey. I don't remember the exact words, but I'm going to recommend that everyone, and I'll put a link to it in the description, along with this, that people go watch this because I got emotional, the whole thing. Because of how you were talking and just how raw and real you were about what was going on there. Can you sort of recap a little bit so that, I could show a clip, but, I'll let them go watch it. But maybe you could kind of recap what was going on for you then, because when I first watched the video, you introduced yourself by another name, and I wasn't even sure it was you. I thought, wait, is this a story? Is this like a testimonial? So I had to go back and watch and saw that the thing said, in 2011, I had a different name. I had a totally different life, and I watched it from a totally different space because now I knew this is the woman I'm getting ready to talk to who everything I'd seen up to that point was just this strong, vibrant, full of energy, super, like totally not the woman I saw in that black and white video, right? So as we lead up to this conversation about empathy, I kind of like to understand how you got from that place, which was, you were there to where you are now. I'd really like to understand kind of the things, and I think that'll obviously set up the rest of our conversation pretty well. So if you just tell a little bit of that backstory, like how you even got to this empathy conversation in the first place, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So that video, which I shot in, I think the beginning of 2012, 2011, I was in a pretty rough place in my life. I had my son, and he was at that point about a year and a half old. And he was a big wake-up call for me because I realized as I looked at him and he was getting older already and beginning to take in the world and show up as himself. And I looked at him and I thought, I want to be the kind of parent who can tell my kids, you can be whoever you want to be when you grow up. But I can't in integrity do that if I'm not doing that myself. And it was a very upsetting recognition because all of a sudden I looked at the life that I had built for myself, which from the outside looking in at the time was a life that I should have wanted. It was a life that should have felt good. I had a white picket fence. I had a golden retriever in the yard. I had married my college sweetheart. And I looked the picture of like California awesomeness. Mm-hmm. And on the inside, I felt like I was dead. I had no sex drive. I was basically a walking robot.
Can we talk about that for a second? Yeah, I really could.
Yeah.
Because I think there's so much that is relatable there. And the thing that really got me about that video was what you said about how we talk to our kids. Now, you had said we very often tell our kids you can be anything, you can do anything, all of that, but then we don't live the example. And it's a very similar thing. Like people would ask me, how do I teach our kids about the law of attraction? Well, you don't sit them down in front of the secret and then do the same stuff you've always been doing. You must lead. You must demonstrate this. And so I could really, really feel that in your voice. So tell me a little bit about like what were you up to at that point that you were, I guess, trying to do, or who were you trying to be? Like where was this big disconnect?
Yeah, so I had started blogging because I was really exploring what does it mean to be happy as a modern human right now. I'm certainly not happy, and yet I should be, or I feel like I should be. And so, is there something wrong with me, or is there something wrong with our culture? Or is there nothing wrong and this is an invitation to grow?
Hmm.
And so I had started blogging about this and making videos, which is why that video exists. And I'm so grateful that I documented this part of my journey because it has become this huge framework for what I do now. Because I had to, I think, really get out of the stupor and the numbing that I had gotten all too used to. I had to be numb because I was in a job at the time that I really hated. I was actually in charge of marketing a product I didn't even believe in.
Hmm.
So here I was being a parent trying to be in integrity with my child and live a real example of how I want him to be in his life. And yet I'm going to work from 9 to 5 at this job marketing a thing that I am totally against as a person. And I don't need to like get into what that was, but
Right.
it just didn't fit. And there were so many pieces of my life at the time that didn't fit. And I felt really trapped by that because here I had made this commitment to this person who I had married to. I was in a mortgage. I was now a parent. And so I think a lot of us can relate to this feeling of like, well, crap, what do I do? Because I've said yes to all this stuff. And what if that yes is no longer authentic? What do I do now?
Yeah, and that I think is definitely something that people can relate to, that I've made all these decisions thinking that these were who I was going to be, and then you get to that point and now you realize, wow, no. Now what a lot of people do is just roll over and get complacent and say, I guess this is it, right? I guess I can't have the ideal life. And what I really got from that video was like that was just like not an option for you. It was either, like why go on if I can't be who I'm going to be, if I can't be this example. So now what I don't know is what happened, to change all of that. And so that's what I want to hear.
So much happened. I started asking small questions about what I could change about my life. Maybe I could get in better shape. Maybe I could change my diet. Maybe I could change my style. Maybe I could change my job. Maybe I could move. And then as I asked those questions, began to make changes that were like incrementally more authentic to who I felt like I was really supposed to be. It became easier to start tackling the bigger questions. And one of the biggest questions at the time happened to be my marriage. And what quickly became clear was that the person who I was when I said yes to this decade-long relationship, so this was not a short-term thing,
Mm-hmm.
was no longer the person who I was now, and really wasn't the real person that I was inside at that time. And so I had to come to grips with this possibility that maybe my marriage wasn't until the traditional death do you part, but maybe it was until the death of who I was.
Mm.
And when that began to kind of solidify, it did become clear that that was no longer going to be the healthiest choice for me, even though it was a fine relationship. And I think a lot of people struggle with saying no to something that's not a fit unless it's really, really terrible.
Right.
And
It's
so it's
tolerating. People just
so
tolerate.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll tolerate their entire lives away when joy is just on the other side of a really hard decision. Like I can relate to that story
Yeah.
of being like, well, it's not, it's so that must gather to you must have taken so many really just freaking incredibly brave leaps of faith where you just had no idea what was going to happen on the other side. But that's what people have to do. They have to move through that just insane comfort zone if they're going to move into something spectacularly different than what they've done. What were some of the biggest? I mean, obviously, ending a marriage that's not easy. So, given that that's a big challenge, and you got through that, what were some of the other things that you were up against that that could have slowed you down or stopped the average person or whatever?
Yeah, so many. I met someone who I wasn't sure was, a long-term option for me, but it was a wake-up call to what was possible inside of a relationship. And this is kind of as I transitioned out of my marriage. And that person was moving indefinitely to the Amazon jungle in Peru. And so I really couldn't like pin my future to this person, which was actually probably the best possible thing. But what it did do was invite me to go to places literally in the world that I had never dreamed of exploring, and also places in my own consciousness that I had no idea I could access. So another leap of faith I took was to jump on a 9-hour plane ride to go down into the Amazon jungle and spend some time with this person who was pretty much a mystery to me still. I'd only known him in person for 3 weeks before he moved to Peru. And so I left my child behind with his dad and with my parents and went on this adventure, which was huge because it was saying, I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing myself, and I'm going to go put myself in real uncomfortable physical circumstances and rustic lodgings in the jungle. I'm going to drink ayahuasca. I'm going to get real uncomfortable with this person who feels like a fit, but I have no real idea.
So,
Yeah.
how petrified were you?
Petrified.
Hmm.
It was every single edge of fear that I've ever known in that whole process, starting from the plane ride on through, because I have PTSD from a very close call in an airplane. And so even getting on an airplane
Wow.
took me years to be able to do after that incident.
So, if you were to look at the type of lifestyle you were living, how like impossible was it for you to consider going to the jungle and doing all of these things? Like, how contrary was that to who you had been up to that point?
It was so contrary that it wasn't even in my frame of reference. I was taking so many safe routes in my life prior to this kind of turning point. I didn't even get on an airplane on my own honeymoon because I was so scared of all the possibilities that that could entail. So I took a cruise. So, I mean, I made every other kind of choice besides the choices that I was now making. And so the type of person I was becoming was a vast departure from who I was. And I was almost unrecognizable to myself. And I was definitely unrecognizable to my first husband, his whole family, my whole family. And that's part of the reason why I now have a different name. I mean, every single aspect of who I was up until that turning point at age 31 is now completely and utterly different. And I can tell that story too.
Well, you got a lot of stories, I'm quite sure. So, I want to understand, just for the sake of kind of taking it to empathy, like where
Yeah.
did that play in to your journey? Like understanding empathy, and why then did you just suddenly focus on it so much?
Yeah, because what I realized was that my patterns of decision making up until that turning point were based on making everybody else happy, on
Hmm.
being the good girl, on doing what was right. And really that meant just avoiding discomfort because I did not know at the time that I was an empath. And yet I could feel everyone else's expectations of me, feel their hopes for me, feel their discomfort around me when I started to push edges or walk the line. And I didn't do it for 30 years because it made me so uncomfortable feeling everybody else's stuff that I just started playing it safe.
And yet you didn't
And
understand that it was other people's stuff at that point, right? It felt like,
no.
it seems like when I think about empathy, and I've had many conversations with people about this, and this is so it's so great to talk to somebody who really knows what they're talking about because I can just theorize. But I've always thought that, for me, well, so I thought if I'm in a situation and somebody's got some negative energy going, they're complaining about something or whatever, you can just tell there's something going on. And then I start to feel that or feel that discomfort, I would think, well, maybe, because I'm an energy person, right? I'm sure, right? Everything's energy. And I'm thinking, well, maybe there's something in there that is aligning with something in me and it's bringing it out, right? It's like there's this resonance happening. So it's really whatever their stuff is, it's speaking to me and it's drawing it out. And it makes, but it also, I take a different level of ownership of it. Like I'm taking on their stuff and I'm saying, this is my stuff. And then I see people who it's almost like they say, they blame everything on empathy. It's like, well, I just take on other people's energy, and it's like now they're out of the responsibility of it. So it's like, so after a while, I'm like, I don't know what to make of people who are calling themselves empaths, because I see that sometimes they use it as just a reason to not take charge of it, or they just don't know that they can. And that's why I really wanted to have this conversation, because clearly they can. You've got work around that. Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I find that most empaths are using their empathic superpowers as an excuse not to show up for themselves in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be some tough medicine to swallow. But by avoiding your own experience and your own emotions, and by constantly disempowering yourself to dissolve into other people's emotions and experiences, then you don't have to show up for yourself. You don't have to make difficult decisions. You don't have to take responsibility for your life. And so you
Yep.
can keep pointing the finger at everything else that's going wrong and saying, well, I can never be successful because look at all the other people in power and they're all jerks and I don't want to be like that. And it just goes on and on and on. And so seeing how disempowered I was in my life and the kinds of decisions I made from that place, even though they all belong and they're all an important part of my story, I no longer wanted to be living like that. And so I think as empaths, there's an opportunity to get really sick of these same patterns and how they play out, and getting tired of blaming other people. And it's not about like saying, oh, well, now this is all my fault and then victimizing yourself. It's to
Mm-hmm.
say, well, what can I do with these superpowers I have? There must be something more interesting to do with them than just constantly disappearing into other people's experiences. And I say, yes, there's a lot of interesting things we can do with this stuff.
I really like the fact that you call it a superpower, because I mean, when you think about it, being empathetic, on the surface, it's a good thing. I mean, you're caring for somebody, whatever. There's nothing inherently bad about empathy. It's just how do we manage that, and certainly lose ourselves in it and make it an excuse for not living the lives we love. So now you actually, it sounds like to me, and I think because we're all human beings, we all have the capacity for empathy. So it sounds like you're of the belief that everybody is an empath to some degree, whether or not they're tuned into it, whether or not they let it take over. That's another thing. But if you're struggling with it, and then you say there's 8 different types, and now the quiz that we shared, and then I took it this morning, and I'm a communication empath, which was like, really, well, see, but that would make sense, right? I mean, like to me, like I didn't even know that was one of the types, and because I had some people wrote back and said I'm an energetic empath, I'm emotional, whatever it was, and then when it said communication, I'm like, well, that sounds about right, because I mean, obviously, my whole career is about communicating and using the words, and so everything that was in the description of what a communication empath was like, yeah, that's pretty much me. So it was really interesting, and also the quiz itself was like, there's a bunch of images, and it's and I'm a person who, and I'll bet you hear about this, just gets in my head, wants to pick the right one. Right? No, which one am I really resonating with? And that probably tells something about what type of empath I am too. But when I went through it and I just let go and just said, no, I want to stop overthinking it. I like the owl. I like the purple thing. It's like, it's just, but then it came back and I was like, well, that seems really right. Now with that information, now it's about like, now what do we do with all of that? So one of the things that comes up. Well, let's just back it up. We've already established that basically everybody's an empath, right? But I think if we can let people see, like, how would they know that they're an empath, that this is something that's going on, aside from taking the quiz, which they should do if they haven't already. But what are some other signs for someone who this may be the first time they even heard the conversation? I have no idea. But like, how do you start to go, well, maybe I'm dealing with an empathy issue here?
Yeah, well, one of the first sure signs is that when you go into a room, maybe it's a room with 5 other people in it. Maybe it's a room with only one other person. Maybe it's a whole conference networking event and there's tons of people. But regardless of how many people are in the space, you could be in whatever, a great mood. And let's say you're in a great mood and you walk into this room, and within a few minutes, you notice that everything about how you're feeling has changed. Either you start to notice a sudden onset of anxiety or overwhelm or all of a sudden there's fearful thoughts that are going through your head that you weren't thinking about 5 minutes ago, or maybe you feel very sad, like you've got grief that suddenly is coming up in your consciousness. Essentially, what happens when you're an empath, especially an out of control empath, one that doesn't know this is what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
is that you are very sincerely affected by whatever environment you go into. And it's like you can allow that environment to overtake you and not even know that that's not what's authentic to you, right? It's not that maybe you are sad and you were just happened to be in a good mood today, and then you walk into that room and it suddenly came over you, so you could think, oh, I'm just thinking about that sad thing that happened to me.
Yeah.
But that might not actually be what's going on.
So that can feel very overwhelming and helpless to people, obviously. And they're and then they discover, okay, I'm an empath, and they hear like, what can I do? And they Google something maybe, and then they hear about setting up a shield or whatever. So, and I know that that's something that is talked about all the time. I'm gonna surround myself with white light, and I'm gonna go in here and all that. But look, there may be some people who aren't that woo woo yet, right? They just don't. They just know that they're feeling this way, because that's, in my career with the law of attraction, it's all about dealing with the people who aren't necessarily woo woo. It's like bringing it down to reality, right? But what we're talking about here, we're sort of talking about like invisible communication and energy, and it's kind of woo woo, right? So how do we help a person who's like kind of like this about woo woo stuff get a handle on this?
Yeah. Well, I want to just start off by saying the reason why casting a shield or surrounding yourself with white light doesn't work. Not only is it too woo-woo for the vast majority of people, but also it's continuing the same line of thought that's causing the empath problems to begin with, which is that it's all about everybody else. Right. And so the way that we as empaths begin to step back into our power is not by keeping everybody else out. It's by letting ourselves out. Right. So if you put a shield around yourself, what also is happening is you're keeping yourself in.
Yeah.
You're not radiating out. And so the best remedy for an empath is to begin to express yourself. It's to begin to say things like yes and no, and to get really curious about what is it that I want? What is it that I need? For a lot of people, especially those of us who are healers and caregivers and who have our hearts wide open,
Mm-hmm.
we are not used to thinking about ourselves. We have been told that this is arrogant, this is self-centeredness, this is bad juju. We are not supposed to think about ourselves like that. And that's actually step number one to beginning to operate as an empath in a much more holistic, grounded, functional way, is to dare to ask yourself, well, what am I about and what's authentic to me, and who even am I, so that I can figure out what I'm being authentic to.
What might that look like when you're in a situation, whether it's a conversation with somebody or you're at a party and you're feeling that overwhelm? What can you do in that moment to kind of bring it back and you, doing what you say? How would showing yourself and showing up and expressing, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I have a little story from my own experience. Back when I was not as empowered, when I would go to a party and feel like it was time for me to go, because I'm an introvert, and so I would get very easily overwhelmed and just kind of not replenished by these experiences. And so I'd find myself saying to my husband, you know what, I think they want everybody to go, so let's just go, instead of consulting myself and saying, no, actually, I'm the one that really wants to go. And maybe I just need a little bit of a break. And so what it looks like now is when I start to notice that feeling of like, it's time to go, I will just simply advocate for my needs and say, hey, I'm feeling really tired, or it's time for me to go into a different mode now. I need to go replenish myself. So I'm either going to go take a break outside, I'm going to go get some water from the kitchen, or it's time for us to go ahead and go back home. Instead of saying, hey, I think they want us to go, so I don't have to say that I want to go and maybe hurt some feelings along the way.
Right.
I'm not so worried now about hurting feelings. I'm more concerned about ignoring what I need.
Yeah, I think it comes back down to being your authentic self and not trying to, make everybody happy or whatever. And I think that's probably something that empaths might do, right? People
Yeah.
pleasing. And so would you, so you do talk about people pleasing. You say you're a former people pleaser. Is that kind of an indication of being like, what kind of, does that fall into a particular type of empath, or does that whole people pleasing thing, does that span several or all of them?
Yeah, it's pretty common to most types of empaths. And another thing that you might not associate with being an empath, but that might actually be part of your experience as an empath is being a perfectionist, getting things exactly right.
Interesting.
And procrastinating because things aren't exactly right, or you don't have exactly what you need yet, or you don't know enough yet. A lot of those stories are coming from that not enoughness, from, again, like not really taking responsibility for showing up in your life, which is the shadow empath. So if you're a perfectionist and a people pleaser, it may just be a symptom of something deeper going on with you, which is that you're feeling so much like everyone's expectations or hopes or desires for you, and you're afraid of not measuring up.
Wow.
And so you
Okay.
just don't show up.
That's freaking awesome and huge, because I'm thinking of the perfectionists in my life, myself included, although I'm not as bad as I used to be, but every now and then it shows up. But they are also very empathetic. They are the people who feel everybody's energy and take on the stuff. But I never would have linked perfectionism and procrastination, all that, to the expectations of others and things like. I mean, obviously, there's something like I want to get it right so that people will like it, but I never would
Mm-hmm.
have tied empathy into that. So
Yeah.
there's help for these people.
There is so much help. There is so much help.
So this
Um,
it seems like so
yeah.
much about boundaries, just boundaries, 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 right? So let's talk about what, because it can be challenging. You said, we're not used to thinking of ourselves. There's all these challenges for an empath to handle this. So, like, how do we even start?
Ah, such a good question. And boundaries are so much more complicated than your average Google search will yield you an answer to.
Uh-huh.
And part of the reason for that is that it isn't just about saying yes and no, although those are critical ingredients for any good boundary system. But it goes deeper than that, because the reason why we say yes and no, and our motivation for those yeses and nos or the maybes, is not necessarily logical. It's actually neurological, and it's based on how our nervous systems were programmed to respond to the world from childhood. And so, in order to actually create functional boundaries for ourselves, it goes beyond our behavior and it starts to go into our physiology and our nervous system and our programmed nervous system responses. And so we have to know what those are and how to begin to engage with that differently. And then, I mean, the whole world opens up to us. It's pretty incredible.
Well, I'm super excited to hear you talk about that, because I love the biology of all of this. Even the law of attraction conversation has a very, I mean, because we're experiencing our experience of reality is through our nervous system and the chemicals that are
Yes.
released and the whole thing. And so bringing this into this, basically, you're talking about some wiring, right? How an empath is wired, and we know that wiring can be changed and modified and all that if we know that and we set a new intention. So again, it's
Yeah.
kind of like if you've got a person who comes to you and they're like, overwhelmed at parties, I'm feeling everybody's energy, blah 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 blah. I'm wired this way. I've always been this way. Whatever it is, like, what's kind of a first step? I guess just to kind of make them feel normal or okay, because I think a lot of people feel like it's a curse rather than a superpower.
Absolutely. And it feels like a curse genuinely because it has all of these negative side effects on our lives. And I actually talk about that. I have a masterclass that's going right now that's a great like entry point to this conversation for folks. And in it, I talk about something that I have discovered in the course of my work with myself and with my clients over the last decade or so. And I call it empath stress disorder. And because I was starting to find these fascinating correlations between things like perfectionism and anxiety and people pleasing, there's actually like a whole host of symptoms to this, what I'm calling a disorder, although it's certainly not like a diagnosis at all. It's just like a cool name for something that I see
Uh-huh.
happening over and over again.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it's really helpful for people to have that feeling of belongingness. Like I'm not weird. I'm not like abnormal. I'm not an outsider. Actually, there's a whole host of people in this world who are having this very similar experience. And what if in community we can all begin to change these stories of I don't belong, I'm not good enough, I'm too much, I'm whatever, and start stepping into a different possibility for ourselves, hey, of our nervous systems. Like, it's so exciting to me to have tools that work and to be able to share them. I've got lots of people taking the masterclass right now, and it's really exciting to see people be like, hey, hands raised, this is totally me. And like, oh my God, thank you for having this conversation.
So let's talk about when a person gets a handle on this and now they can harness this superpower. Aside from just feeling better at a party, what else is possible?
Well, so much is possible because you're now operating from a place of worthiness, not just in your mindset, but in how your body actually engages with all of life, with reality, with your finances, with your kids, with your partner. You start to make decisions in totally different ways. And as you know, our grid of perception is very limited. We're only taking in maybe 10% of the data that's available to us. And so when we start to change the grid through which we're perceiving our reality, and we're going to get a little woo here for a second,
Cool.
we all of a sudden have new opportunities in front of us that aren't really new at all. We just couldn't see them before.
Mm-hmm. Just another shift in perception. We're changing the lens through which we're seeing the world, and things can occur completely differently. So,
Yeah.
do you help people see as because I put the link up for the master class. It's a free class, right?
Yay.
So,
Mhm.
yeah. So definitely, if this is something, but when to help a person be empowered, like with this, what's one of the because again, I run into this all the time, and as a coach, it's very frustrating to run up against somebody who doesn't know how to handle this, and up till now, I've had no specific tool set, to help them with that. It's just kind of like this sticking point where they just keep falling back. But to empower them and go, wow, this can be a superpower. And then you talked about things like finances, which of course, that's a thing. All of these things. So
Such a thing.
I so but it's just I never would have tied any of that into this empathy thing. So it seems like even if you kind of just halfway suspect that maybe this is the thing, there's a lot to learn in this masterclass about just how big of an impact your empathetic nature is having in your life. And if you can just pick up one or two things that can help you rein that in, I could see where it would have this exponentially positive impact in the rest of your life, relationships too, especially. Because I would imagine if you're in a relationship and you're you don't have a handle on your empathy, then arguments, things like that, any kind of disconnect, it can be very confusing. Like, whose thoughts am I even having right now, right? Mm-hmm. And so to be able to harness that, yeah, I mean, I can see where it would be great. And then of course, the good part of empathy, where you can actually help somebody by understanding their feelings a little bit better rather than being taken over by them, would be really powerful as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you could imagine you're sitting in front of your boss trying to negotiate for a raise, and instead of taking on your boss's anxiety about the Q4 projections, you can hold space for that while you step into your power and advocate for yourself. And you end up walking away from that meeting with, more than your 10% raise, or at least, something positive coming from this instead of walking away with nothing changed or worse. So there's very practical ways that this actually works.
Yeah, there's so much. We as humans have so many superpowers. Law of attraction being one of them, empathy, all of this. But since we're never taught that, and we go and we get all wired with everybody else's limitations, and most people don't understand any of this, we start thinking there's something wrong with us, we're abnormal, we're weird, we're all of those things. And then it just begins this spiral of I'm broken and all of that. You use a term called muchness. What does that mean?
Well, if you're like me, you have a big personality and big dreams and a lot of energy. I have so much energy that I'll short circuit internet connections sometimes.
Well,
so
don't do it right now.
Okay, I know, I'm doing my best. But when I was little, I was told things like, "You're too sensitive."
Yeah.
my friends at school told me that I was too much like Punky Brewster with my style. Um, I was too bitchy for not saying yes to every boy that asked me out in fifth grade. There was always like this too much judgment that was made of me. And so I think that people, when they experience that, they can go one of two ways. And sometimes we go both in succession. The first way is often to shut it all down and say, okay, well, if I'm too much, then obviously there's something wrong with me. So I'm just going to toe the line and, look at everybody else who seems to be normal and getting away with it and just figure out what they're doing and kind of imitate that. And that comes at a huge expense of our
Yeah,
own
soul crushing.
authenticity,
Yeah,
self-expression.
absolutely.
It's absolutely soul crushing. Or we go the other direction where we say, F you, I'm going to be like all the muchness. And I'm going to kind of go through this flaming phase where I even go above and beyond my muchness to kind of compensate for the rejections that I've had. And I think that what tends to happen is that we have the suppression and then we have a massive flame out. And then what's actually authentic to us is probably somewhere in our own like bell curve middle ground. And that's unique for all of us. But I certainly have had that experience myself where I've totally repressed myself. I've totally gone 180 degrees in the other direction. And now I'm obviously self-expressed. I have glitter and face paint on and have my own sense of style, which I actually use as a tool. But I'm not aggressively putting myself in people's faces. I don't need to like prove myself. I'm just being, and I think that it takes a while to get to that place where you find that place.
Well, and that's a fine line because there are people who learn these types of ideas and then they just become freaking obnoxious.
Yep.
It's like, oh, I got this and you're that. You're right. So I mean, and that's a fine line too. And there's not much happiness in that either because they're going to feel, being empaths, that people are thinking that about them. And again, it's just like managing all of that. So this master class, go ahead if you don't mind, just kind of walk us through sort of as we go through this. What are we going to walk away with?
Yeah, so the first class really helps you see whether you have ESD, which is what I call empath stress disorder. And I go through the 8 indications that what's going on in your life may actually have at its root that you are an empath. You may not have ever known you were an empath, but if you have some or all of these indicators, it's a pretty good chance that you are. And then with that information, you can begin to move through into a place of more empowerment, which is where we go to in video 2, where I teach you all the ways that I started to make those really tough decisions. How did I change my career path? How did I start asking hard questions of my marriage or, of my life purpose, things like that? Those are not easy decisions to make. But there is a very clear process to begin to make those decisions to create, immediate benefit in your life. And I teach that whole entire framework. It's actually way more simple than you might think. That's video 2. And then in video 3, we start talking about boundaries. It's a real deep topic, but there are 2 critical reframes that I teach my clients and my students that if you start to put them into place in your life, you will see an immediate change in the way that you're interacting with people and the amount of energy and emotions that you're taking on. So that's class number 3. And then in class number 4, we start to get into the nervous system and you'll get to see a little preview of what's in my big class.
Well, we'll talk about just briefly about the big class because I get the idea that this free masterclass is going to be huge, wide open, eye-opening for people. I'm very interested in it. Obviously, it's going to help me become a better coach for sure, understanding this process. So it's a no-brainer that I will be looking at that. But then, so they're going to walk away with empowerment. They're going to feel empowered, clearly. And this whole show, the Bob Doyle Show, is all about these little things that make your life just a little bit better, right? Make it a little happier, a little bit. And this whole empathy thing does take people's lives over, and it impacts them sometimes in a very negative way, so unnecessarily. So then now we got the master class, and they've got some skill sets now, and now it's like, so what's next?
So what's next is to begin to take the inquiry much, much deeper down into the body, down into the unconscious programming that the body is living out every single day, and begin to systematically understand and then begin to shift how your nervous system actually processes the world. So we need to go into your senses and sensory gating, because I bet you didn't know that you could use your senses of smell and taste and hearing to help you manage your day-to-day life as an empath. These are things that nobody is talking about. And I love getting really nerdy about the science aspects
Me
because
too.
it's so fun.
Right. Well, and also, again, it bridges that gap between the woo-woo people and the people who need science to even consider this. But this is why it's so exciting to me, because I've been riding that science woo-woo wave for years, and even more recently, just really into like our hormonal system and what makes us really feel like what we feel, and this is definitely causes chemical reactions when we're feeling like what's wrong with me and all these other things. And just a small shift and a little bit of understanding, you go from feeling completely disempowered to absolutely empowered. I mean, it's just like these distinctions. If you just understand that you're not a weirdo and it's all normal and it's actually a superpower. I just think that really, if people could think about it that way, and really understand that if I understand this more, it becomes a superpower, then we've really got something. So that's all great. Now, so I hope everybody's going to stampede to the masterclass, and that's great. Yes. Now, I have to, this is kind of an aside, and this is just my own natural curiosity, and it's kind of a leap, and it's definitely, well, let me put it this way. It seems on the surface to be super woo-woo, but I do know that I've got an audience who will love this piece, and a lot who won't understand it all and go, oh, I just went off the deep end. But, so we've got these.
Ooh.
Right? So now these are your tarot cards, right?
Yes.
All animal-based, and a whole book that explains all of these things. Now you have these as a tool in this whole conversation. Like when I first saw these, I was like, well, are we talking about tarot or are we talking about empathy? Like what are we, empathy, okay, great. But then I realized, well, you're using this as a tool to help with this. Can you just talk about these for just a little bit? For my woo-woo
Sure.
folks, and then also for the folks who, maybe it's not as woo-woo as we think.
Yeah, maybe not. Well, first I have to say that tarot can kind of have a bad rap. I know a lot of folks who come from maybe more traditional spiritual backgrounds even feel like it's dangerous, and so I want to allay the fears that the tarot cards are showing you anything other than your own knowledge. What tarot is as a tool is a way of bringing the unconscious to consciousness, bringing what you're not aware of to clarity. And so as an empath, because for some time until you learn how to navigate this space, it's really hard to tell what is yours and what's not yours. Mm-hmm. And we'll go into a bit about why that question can be distracting inside the masterclass. So if you're like, ooh, I think I might have that problem, check out the masterclass. But with tarot, what it can do is if you use the cards to ask yourself a question and then pull a card to get a response, that response is not coming from anywhere but inside of you, in a way that you can receive and understand it. And that's what I love about our tarot deck, is that it's not using esoteric symbolism. It's using animals like the blue jay or the black bear or a cardinal or a giraffe.
They're really beautiful.
Thank you.
They're really beautiful. They got this really cool textured purple back. This is like my favorite colors all on one card, and really cool artwork on all of them. And I think what I wanted to hear you say in essence is this is you don't have to think about this as magic, right?
No.
I mean, it's not like we're summoning spirits and all of this. We're tapping into what's already there. And that's something I have learned recently about tarot, because I had no clue. And so, but I just wanted you to address this because because I know a lot of people are super into these. They love to pull cards every day and all of that. And so if they can integrate these cool things into their work on themselves with the empathy, that'd be great. Can you get these at your website? Is that where we can get these?
Yeah, you can actually get them They're called the Wild Messengers Tarot, and you can go to wildmessengers.com and find them. And I have a link on my website too somewhere, but in case you can't find it, it's wildmessengers.com.
Well, I
And
definitely recommend everybody go to your website because there's so much there, and you do so much stuff. You got coaching intensives and things like that where people come out and hang with you for a few days, and just a lot of cool stuff. And as I go through all this, and again, I just go back to bring this all the way around, the contrast of this woman who I'm talking to right now, and the one who made that video, and clearly what you're doing is you're sharing the benefit of your journey with other people, because I know that there are a lot of people who share that. It may not be the exact same situation that you had, but that's sort of like, I must love my life. I must be who I want to be, and it's tearing me apart that I can't. And your frustration, and that almost, since it was borderline hopelessness, and yet a commitment, like, no, I'm not going to be brought down by this. And then so we close the curtain on that, and then you take this incredible journey, and now you're back, and you got glitter on your face and the whole thing, and you're living out loud, and you're helping people to feel good about this gift, really a gift that we all have, that sometimes, and I think there's a lot of gifts like this out in the world, that when we don't understand how to use them or how to manage them, they take us over, and we think it's a curse. But this is something that's so pervasive, and again, with all the stimulation that we've got now, and we're bombarded more than ever, we're bombarded with other people's energy. Even like in just a Facebook post, we're picking up on people's energy. I can't even imagine what an ultra sensitive person is dealing with when they just scroll the Facebook. It must be totally exhausting, and overwhelming.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and so to be able to have this tool set and understand what kind of empath you are, and that's even a part of you. I think what's great about this is that, so the quiz is really, it's easy, and it just takes a few minutes, and then the master class, we're going to bridge the gap of science and give you some explanation. It's not, it seems like it's for everybody. It's not whether you're woo-woo or whatever. It's just like, if you even think for a moment that this might be your thing, or even if you're just a little bit curious, if you ever feel pulled by what's going on out there, right, and pointing at that and going, this is messing me up, right, this feels like just a wonderful way to take back that power.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's totally my mission. The person you're looking at today is not the person I was. Oh, and by the way, I married the dude in Peru. We've been together for 7 years now and have a daughter of our own. So, it is very possible to utterly transform your lived experience through this work. And I'm living proof, and it's not just me. It's the thousands of people that I work with all the time now. And it's just like, I want to see all of us highly sensitive, empathic, heart opened people out there succeeding in the world, because our world, our human world, could really use that right now.
Right.
We could use a whole lot more heart, and we can't get broken down by all the stuff that's out there. We got to just keep showing up.
And when a person can start to feel their value being put out in the world and not feel, it is such a game changer, not just for them, but for everybody that they will impact in their life, everybody who's waiting for them to step into their power and play that bigger game benefits from this. So it's just a total win with these nice little skill sets that we can learn from this free masterclass. And
That's right.
And then onward. So, well, Lola, thank you so much for sharing this, because I've learned a ton, and I'm absolutely I'm really looking forward to going through the masterclass and figuring out this next step and all that, because again, just not just for myself, but just as a coach, it's going to be super helpful for me to see that and be able to say, go take this masterclass. Like right away, I've got something to help people so that they can reel that in, and now, wow, it's like I'm dealing with a totally different person, instead of all the disempowered stories that we got to work through and do EFT on and all this stuff, right? All this releasing, just feeling great about, wow, I do have this superpower, and I'm learning how to use it, and look at what good I'm doing. So it's a great thing you're doing out here. Super happy to talk to you, and I can't wait to take the masterclass. So thank you so much, and I hope that we can come back around and talk again, because you've got so much else we could talk about.
I have so much else, and I just really appreciate being here with you, Bob. And may everybody who feels overwhelmed and anxious because life, may you gain something beautiful and empowering in this conversation. And if you come play with me over in the masterclass and in the rest of my world, it's a pretty awesome place to be.
Sounds like fun. Lola Pickett, thank you so much. We'll talk soon.